Yes, sir.
Yep.
Okay, so we are delighted to have Yashvanth Kondi here. He's a principal scientist at Silence Laboratories, and before that he did his PhD under with Yashvanth at Northeastern University, and even before that he was a PhD student here, master's student here at IIIT Bangalore. And after that, I think he did a short postdoc at Aarhus, right? And yeah. All yours.
Thanks for the introduction. Okay, so I'll be speaking about separating broadcast from cheater identification, which is a joint work with Divya Ravi at the University of Amsterdam. So as an overview of what I'm going to be covering, I'll first start off by introducing MPC and what it means to get identifiable abort. Then I'll talk about the problem that we identified, which is that most known protocols for identifiable abort use a broadcast channel, which also I'll get into. And instantiating broadcast in practice can be quite expensive, or even instantiating in theory can be quite expensive. And so we ask if this is inherent that MPC protocols that achieve identifiable abort should inherit the complexity of broadcast. And we show that this is not necessarily the case. We formulate this notion of broadcast identifiable abort, like BCIA, that characterizes exactly what we would want in the IA setting, which is a bit different from what we would want from broadcast regularly. We show that it's impossible to achieve this notion in the dishonest majority setting. But on the other hand, we show that in the honest majority setting, there's actually a pretty simple two-round protocol. I'll give the whole protocol here today. And we use this to build a general compiler. In particular, we start with any MPC protocol that achieves the standard notion of identifiable abort. And assuming that the protocol uses R invocations of broadcast, like R consecutive broadcast rounds, we compile this to a protocol that can use R+1 instances of BCIA, so our modified primitive. And then we instantiate this BCIA primitive over point-to-point channels to ultimately get a protocol that suffers maybe a blow-up of a run complexity of 2, but runs over only point-to-point channels. And I'll show that you can apply this principle to a concrete real-world application that is a threshold ECDSA signing. I'll talk about why it's important and so on later on. But yeah, I'll get into it. But basically, this notion of BCIA is not feasible to achieve in the dishonest majority setting. Okay, so as a quick reminder, secure multi-party computation, or MPC, allows a bunch of parties who each have some private input to obtain some joint function to jointly evaluate some function on their inputs, private inputs. So ideally, let's say we had some sort of box that had this function baked into it. Each of these parties could send their respective inputs to this box, and then the box would compute an ideal output. I mean, would compute the output without revealing any sort of intermediate state. But of course, we don't have such ideal parties in the real world. And so what an MPC protocol allows us to do is have each of these parties exchange some messages and then derive the output as though they were speaking to an ideal party. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on the details of how such protocols work and so on, but what I do want to focus on is active security. That is, in the event that one or more of these parties is corrupt, what happens to the protocol? So it could be that this corrupt party starts to fiddle with the messages per the protocol, like they deviate from the protocol specification in some way. And now, depending on what guarantees this MPC protocol offers, different things could happen to the output, right? And that's what I want to focus on. So there are different grades of security that one can achieve in the event that one of the parties is corrupt. And so security with abort, fairness, and guaranteed output. In particular, what security with abort guarantees is privacy, in the sense that the input stays safe, but the output may be delivered to only the adversary. The adversary may decide that the honest parties are not going to get the output. So yeah, I'm putting down what the adversary gets on the left-hand side and what the honest parties get on the right-hand side. What fairness says is that the adversary has a choice. If it wishes to get the output, then it must also let the honest parties see the output. But it can also choose to forego the output, in which case the honest parties may also not get the output. And then finally, the strongest notion is that of guaranteed output delivery, in which no matter what the adversary does, the honest parties always get the output of the computation. There's nothing that the adversary can do to stop the honest parties. And intuitively, why this notion is useful is that it achieves resilience to denial of service attacks. So where in settings where like liveness is important, I mean, this goes by different names. In some papers it's called robustness, sometimes it's called liveness, whatever. But basically, the idea behind guaranteed output is to provide resilience to denial of service attacks. But I just want to reiterate that in all cases, privacy of the inputs is always preserved. The difference across these notions is basically denial of service resistance. And as sort of an intermediate compromise notion, we have this thing called identifiable abort, in which the adversary could stop honest parties from learning the output. But in this event, the honest parties identify who exactly the cheater is. So maybe they can take some action based on this. That's sort of the compromise notion that we're looking at. So what's the trade-off, right? There are these different notions. Why not just go for the strongest one? So we know that security of the bot and identifiable abort are feasible under standard assumptions, even if there's only one honest party. It's the strongest possible corruption resilience that you can ask for. I mean, not counting adaptive and so forth, but this is known as far back as GMW, or as far back as the 80s. And we also know, because of an impossibility that has to do with coin tossing, thanks to Cleve, that fairness and guaranteed output for general functions can't be achieved if a majority of parties are not honest. That is, we need an honest majority of parties to be able to think about achieving these notions. There's a caveat that if you can allow bias in the, if you can relax the functionality a bit to allow some sort of residual functions and so forth, then we can achieve these notions even in the dishonest majority setting, but that's not relevant for this. It's not super relevant for what we care about. But also, in general, if we look at some setting where any of these notions might be feasible, for example, the honest majority setting, as sort of a high-level statement, I claim that known constructions for different security levels get more expensive or get more complex, at least, as the security level that you want goes up, right? So with T less than n/2, security of the bot is going to be much cheaper than guaranteed output. But this is a very loose statement, because as we will see, we don't really have tight characterizations of what happens in the middle. And given that, let's say any of these notions is feasible in a setting, ideally you'd like to shoot for the strongest thing, but maybe you can't get it sometimes. So identifiable abort in the literature has typically been studied as something of a compromise when we can't get guaranteed output. But I'll try and make the case that even if guaranteed output is feasible in a certain setting, what we might actually want would be identifiable abort. Let's say we have a friend Bob who has some secret input. He can secret share this input amongst a bunch of servers and store each share on a different server. The reason he does this is when he wants to evaluate some function on these inputs, rather than evaluating it locally, what he can do is run some sort of protocol amongst these servers and then get the output. And this is the configuration that we're looking at. So now what happens if one of these servers is corrupt? So let's take a look, right? If in the guaranteed output case, what we are able to say is that after the MPC has started, and if some attack has been detected, what the protocol will tell us is the system is actively under attack. There is some node that's compromised. I can't say which one, but here you can have the output, and I hope you're happy with that. What the identifiable abort protocol will do is tell you that the protocol is started, and unfortunately it failed to give us output. But concretely, node P1 is the one who's compromised, and do what you will with that information. Right. So in many situations, it could be that you're not that interested in getting the output right away, but what's more important is figuring out what has happened, or like who has been hacked, or like who the problematic node is. One concrete application of this is this, maybe to like look up later, this notion of restaking. Basically, it's the sort of ecosystem in which there are different operators of nodes who can buy into a protocol by restaking or pledging some assets. And in case they're detected to have deviated from the protocol, it's detected that they've deviated from this protocol, then whatever stake they've pledged or whatever assets they've pledged are taken away from them. The technical term is flashing. And this gives some notion of economic security, in that parties are now disincentivized from deviating from the protocol. And I claim that identifiable abort is a natural fit for this setting, because if the protocol itself tells you who exactly is cheated, then this can naturally be plugged into these disincentive mechanisms. And so this gives, in some sense, a heuristic way of getting guaranteed output. And the hope as to why we want to look at these heuristics is that the complexity of achieving identifiable abort should ideally be closer to the cheaper one, that security of the bot, than the more expensive guaranteed output delivery notion. And so in principle, you could use out-of-band methods, and this is what happens in practice today, which is that in case there's some node that's failed for some reason, then you like try and debug it through some systems methods. But for the scope of this talk and for the scope of, I guess, like provable guarantees in general, we want some protocol mechanism that's going to tell us who caused the problem, right? So in particular, I'm specifying the problem a bit more, which is that in the event that a party observes a cheat, or in the event that a party is unable to get output, it's able to get a certificate that says this party is the one who caused the problem. Right? So if I'm a party in the protocol and I'm unable to get the output, then I should be able to prove to other people that, let's say, P1 is the node who cheated, and that there's no ambiguity about that. And another important relaxation that I'm making is that there's not necessarily consensus on the identity. So if there are 3 of us and 2 of us observe a cheat, actually 3 parties, it doesn't make sense, but let's say there are a lot of people and 2 of us observe a cheat, maybe we identify different people who cheated. Right. So this allows us, looking ahead, this is going to allow us to get around consensus, which is one of the properties that broadcast delivers. So please stop me and ask me if there are any questions at any point. Yeah. Remind you what? Oh, okay. That's just to rule out like heuristic methods of, I mean, it's not a protocol mechanism, but maybe you do some forensics or something like that. Yeah. Which is, I think, pretty much the only recourse at the moment for a lot of deployments.
All of this is under the synchronous setting.
I haven't specified that yet, but I will get into that in a second. So there are basically 2 ways that you can think about a cache protocol, right? One is to send a protocol message that's not well formed. The other is to just not send a message. And not sending a message is not very well defined in the asynchronous setting, right? Because if I don't receive a message from someone, it could be because they are corrupt or because they are just cut off from the network. So at least like the standard notion of identifiable abort, I don't think is well defined in the asynchronous setting.
So it's not identity. That's generally a nicer thing than having consistency.
I mean, I would say it's weaker, but
the reason I think it's nicer is because if I have no consistent consensus or identity, then we might be able to jointly identify more cheaters in a single.
So it could be that the adversary decides. So at least at the ideal level, the adversary decides who's identified. Right? So it could be that there are multiple cheaters, but the adversary gets to choose who's identified. So the adversary could decide to induce consensus, for example.
Yes.
So it's not the case that we catch everybody who deviates. And for that matter, even defining what it means to deviate is actually pretty tricky. But yeah, it's a relaxation. So this is a strictly weaker problem.
I think you should be able to do a certificate if you manage to identify someone who actually knowledge is.
Oh yeah, for sure. So sorry, but you have a second thought.
No, basically that means like what he's saying, why is it not like why is it not?
I'm saying that you might be correct, but you don't deviate.
There's that. I mean, it could also be that you deviate in a way that I could define an algorithm that, let's say, sees 2 deviations and ignores one and outputs the other one. So yeah, it's I would say extremely difficult to define, maybe even impossible to define some notion of catching all people who deviate from the protocol, right? Because so looking ahead, like intuitively, GMW gives you something like this, where like you prove every step in zero knowledge. So if you're not able to prove it, that means you're cheating. But even then, what about the randomness that you use to compute the proof or like something like that? And I think there's a sort of strong dependency on the way that you would define that. There's a strong dependency on broadcast. Like especially like this is something that we realized in this project, which is if the protocol runs over point-to-point channels, I don't think it's possible to define pure honest behavior in some sense, or like to define what it means to deviate from the protocol in a tight way. Because if I am supposed to send something to Chetan, for example, and I just don't send it, that's completely unverifiable. And I've deviated from the protocol in a way that is inherently cannot be verified. Yeah, so sort of at a high level, yeah.
Okay. The guarantee is only that you would either deliver the output or identify something.
Hmm.
So somebody could cheat, but as long as they get the, so going back to thing earlier, right now this WhatsApp messages and this first situation could still occur in your thing, right? In the sense that you realize that system is under active attack. You cannot prove to anyone because adversary comes back and fixes things and the output is there. So that situation is still possible even in the identifiable process.
Yes, that's. It's true that in my view, I could see that somebody is cheating,
Yeah.
but I'm unable to prove it because I receive output.
Yeah.
That's true. So this is not a tight thing, I would say. That it's not the case that every deviation gets identified. It's more of in the event that there's a deviation that leads you to not receiving output, then you compute a proof. So that's true that technically even a guaranteed output delivery protocol would achieve this notion just simply because there's no such thing as an abort. That's true. Right, so any more questions? At a high level, this is of course not like a tight characterization or anything, but most MPC protocols that achieve identifiable abort follow this very rough structure, which is that there's some sort of baseline security with the abort protocol, on top of which we can guarantee that every message that's sent in the protocol is well formed. And underneath this protocol, like think of it as a network layer, there's some mechanism that makes sure that every party says something in every run. So this kind of does it, right? You're assuming that everybody sends a message in every round, which is guaranteed over here. Every message is guaranteed to be well formed, which is over here. And if the message is well formed, then the baseline protocol gives you privacy or whatever notion of security. So this is kind of a recipe for achieving identifiable abort. The mechanisms to guarantee that everything is well formed, this can take a number of forms. Like back in the 80s, GMW showed that you can achieve this with just zero knowledge proofs. More recently, there have been efforts to use weaker tools or have more fine-grained characterizations of what we can do, such as more recent works have tried to make black box use of cryptography and avoid, let's say, adaptive security for the underlying primitives, which is there in IOC and so on. So that's not super important, but this is sort of where most of the research on identifiable abort has been recently, I would say. And pretty much all of these works assume that this layer has already been taken care of, which is that all messages are sent over broadcast, right? And intuitively, this is to solve the second problem, right, that I mentioned in the previous slide, which is that if between Chetan and I, there's some sort of conflict that Chetan says he didn't receive a message from me, then there's no way that anyone else can validate it. So what the protocol instructs everyone to do is to just broadcast everything. So if I actually didn't send him a message, then everybody else will be able to see this on the broadcast channel. That's intuitively why it's used. It's a conceptually very simple way of getting rid of the problem, but it, as it turns out, it like induces a can of worms down the line for when you actually want to instantiate these protocols from scratch, right? And that's what the focus of this talk is. So, like, what is broadcast, right? And just the English term is sending something to everyone. So anecdotally, having spoken to like a bunch of engineers who've been trying to implement identifiable abort protocols, either they miss it or they ask, do I really need to implement like verifiable broadcast? And I say yeah, and then they ask, is it just for something that you need to make some proof go through and so on? And I explain, no, it's basically to catch people who don't send messages. I mean, at least it's that. And it seems somewhat unnecessary because there's a whole bunch of heuristics that you can pull from in the real world to catch these kinds of things, like checking server logs or something like that. And there are also other places where it's kind of swept under the rug. For example, in this paper from 22, they have a security of the abort protocol, which is an upgrade to identifiable abort. In the security of the abort protocol, they route all the messages through some centralized coordinator, in the sense that everyone sends a message to a coordinator relays it to everyone else. This is fine in the security of the abort setting because it doesn't change the trust assumption, right? in principle, if the coordinator is corrupt, it could just drop all messages and the protocol ends. That's fine. But in the identifiable abort setting, now the coordinator is much more trusted because the coordinator could falsely accuse someone of not sending messages and so on. Right? So it's somewhat dangerous assumption. And there are other settings where they say, well, use a blockchain, which might be fine to instantiate the broadcast channel, but it's not a generally satisfying solution because it can be slow. It can introduce all sorts of external things to an NPC protocol or an NPC system that's defined amongst a small number of parties or whatever. You don't want external dependencies in general. Okay, so what about just using a broadcast protocol to instantiate the channel? Because this is also a whole separate line of study. So Cohen and Lindell showed that MPC with identifiable abort implies broadcast intuitively because once you have a PKI, that's once you have a public key infrastructure, you can use standard protocols from the 80s, like Dollar Strong is a simple one, to realize broadcast, right? So what their result shows is that you can sort of iteratively try to implement a PKI functionality with identifiable abort, and if that once that ultimately succeeds, then you can use Dollar Strong and get broadcast. But let's say we already have a PKI, right, which we are fine assuming for reasons. So we know that broadcast is feasible, so we don't care so much about this result anymore. Now what do we do, right? But down complexity, it turns out, is quite an issue. So we know from previous work that if we use a deterministic broadcast protocol, this is going to induce a round complexity that's linear in the number of corrupt parties, which is pretty bad. Dollar Strong has this. Or you could use randomized protocols to instantiate broadcast, which are expected constant. And expected constants are kind of tricky to reason about in terms of composition and everything. But even if you're fine with that, the constants that are hiding over here are pretty large. I had to dig a bit, but basically, I think the state-of-the-art paper is on the order of 9 or 10 rounds to the expected constant. So especially with protocols which are, let's say, 2 or 3 broadcast rounds, right? That becomes pretty complex and much more involved if you want to actually instantiate the broadcast channel with the protocol. And this is particularly frustrating because in the security with the bot setting, there's this simple echo broadcasting technique of Goldwasser and Lindell, which just takes 2 rounds and it's as simple as everyone sends to everyone else and everyone echoes what they got in the last round, right? So, I mean, we started this whole talk, or the premise is with, can we achieve identifiable abort with complexity closer to security with the bots than the worst thing? So this is this is the guaranteed output thing. This is the security of the bot thing. And ideally we would want to be closer to here than here. Okay? That's the intuition. So we define what we want, this thing called BCIA. First, we want consistency, which is pretty standard across broadcast requirements, which is that all honest parties will output a message from the dealer. And when they do, they are in agreement. When honest parties output something, they're in agreement. And the maybe non-standard thing is that the message that comes is signed by the dealer. This is not a big deal in the PKI setting because, the dealer can just broadcast signed messages instead of raw messages, but that's fine. And alternatively, if the dealer is corrupt, an honest party could obtain a certificate that is one of 2 things. Either a proof that the dealer tried to cheat, that is a proof that the dealer tried to violate consistency, or if the dealer sent nothing, a proof of non-responsiveness. So like capital omega or little omega. The reason we do this is, like you pointed out earlier, like the identifiable abort is not really well defined in the asynchronous setting, so we stick to the synchronous setting. But in the real world, the real world is not synchronous, right? People could go offline. So you in this higher level protocol where you're punishing people for having caused an abort or something, maybe you want to punish them differently for actively trying to cheat versus they were just offline. And that's the reasoning behind this. So capital omega is a strong cheat, little omega is a weak cheat. And of course, we want to make sure that honest parties can't be framed. So in the synchronous setting, we're going to achieve this notion of defamation freeness, but in asynchronous setting, this is an aside. In the asynchronous setting, it could be that an honest party is blamed with the non-responsiveness thing. All right, so going back to our anatomy. Now we define this we define this notion of broadcast IA that's tailored to this IA setting that can be used to instantiate this mechanism. we're going to show that it's impossible with a dishonest majority, and there's a two-round construction in the honest majority setting. Right, so let's get into the dishonest majority possibility, right? So let's say I have three parties, two of whom are corrupt, P1 and P2. I'll show that there's always going to be an attack to frame P0. So assume towards contradiction that there is a protocol that achieves broadcast IA in this setting, and I'll show that there's always going to be an attack on such a protocol. So consider the alternative scenario where it's actually P0 that's the one that's corrupt. So what P0 could do is just cut itself off from P1 and P2, right? And by virtue of the definition of BCIA, we can argue that P1 and P2 must necessarily output a certificate saying that P0 is offline. Intuitively, it's because the only other option is that they should output a signed message from P0. But of course, assuming the signature is unforgeable, the fact that P0 is just cut itself off means that they can't output a signed message. So it has to be a certificate that says that P0 is offline. There's also like a very subtle point, but this is why like this impossibility doesn't extend to like Dolev-Strong, where Dolev-Strong lets you output like a default message, for example, but we need signed messages to be output. So yeah, this Dolev-Strong wouldn't go through over here. Like wouldn't go through that impossibility. Yeah, so now we can use that mechanism in this scenario. So P1 and P2 are corrupt and they can collude and just pretend that P0 is offline. So whatever mechanism would have caused the generation of that certificate over there can be used by P1 and P2 over here to falsely accuse P0 or falsely prove that P0 was offline, and in fact it wasn't. So that's the attack. And so that's why it's infeasible in the dishonest majority setting. Now let's say we have an honest majority amongst these parties. Yes.
Second, who needs to be able to verify? Is it people? Is there no other people?
No, an external party. So I guess the way we would formalize this is, or the way we do formalize this is that there are external parties who can register with the functionality, and you should be able to convince those new external parties that somebody is actually corrupt.
Verifying parties are ahead of time, like all the parties know who will be there.
No, they're not there ahead of time. They can register after the fact, but technically what they need to do is accept the PKI. So as long as the PKI is visible to these parties, these external parties, like they don't need to receive anything while the protocol is executed. So intuitively, it's going to be like a signature. So think of it as a signature that on the message, this person is corrupt. And as long as you believe that the PKI is honestly generated, then you can verify them.
You want to outside, participants are not aware of the
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that'll become clear in the construction actually. So let's say I have 5 parties, P0 to P4, and P0 is the sender who wants to broadcast a message. So there's a 2-round protocol that we construct that achieves this. It's roughly based on the Goldwasser-Lendl technique, but with a small augmentation. So in the first round, P0 signs a message that it wants to send and sends it to all parties, to every PI. In the second round, every PI just echoes the signed message that it got from P0. But let's say PI didn't receive anything from P0. So what it does instead is sign bot. Like it signs a message saying I received nothing and sends that to all PJs. So finally, what each PI does is first, it checks if it can assemble a certificate. And if there's 2 conflicting messages, like 2 different messages that are both signed by the dealer, that's a very obvious certificate of cheating. If there are 3 messages that are signed, I mean, if there are 3 I received nothing messages that have been signed by other parties, then that gives you a certificate of non-responsiveness. Right? Keep in mind that there can be at most 2 corruptions because we're in the honest majority setting. And if no such certificate can be assembled, then just output whatever message I have. That's my algorithm if I'm PI. So why does this work, right? So first I claim that it's defamation free. In the event that P0 is honest, it's not going to induce a certificate of cheating because it'll never send conflicting, it won't sign conflicting messages. It's not going to induce a certificate of non-responsiveness because now you need, if there are T corrupt parties, you need T+1 signatures on I received nothing to assemble this little omega thing. And because there are only T corrupt parties, nobody is going to be able to assemble a certificate saying that this person is offline. All corrupt parties are going to be at least 1 signature short of assembling this kind of certificate. Now, if sender is corrupt, first we show that it's consistent, right? Which is yeah.
So, first thing, the evidence are the actual message to be sent linked to the broadcast, or are they just some messages in the protocol?
No, this is the input to the thing. Yeah. So
And for the non-responsiveness, is it, so I don't know, maybe this doesn't matter, but if your protocol has many rounds, right, maybe I'm not responsive to some people in some rounds and other. So here you're saying the honest people cannot be framed, but this one is, so what is, like, in every round, do I prepare, like, I was expecting a message, but I didn't get it?
yeah, so I mean, at least right now, the scope is just broadcasting one thing. So this will realize a broadcast functionality. And now a high level protocol can make use of that broadcast functionality, and that's it. And so once the functionality terminates, then it's safe to use that output. So
you're not describing what goes on inside the protocol. It's a functionality.
like this is the protocol that realizes the broadcast functionality. So in a high level protocol, yeah, if I were to call this functionality many times, then in each instance, I would have to do this thing where like I send things and then I wait and so on.
The outputs of the protocol, outputs of the functionality.
Yeah.
When you're saying how that should be used in a higher level protocol, should frame somebody only, or should accuse somebody only if you got +1 digital evidence or one.
Yeah. Or you can think of I mean, that's the concrete protocol. You can think of the ideal functionality as just outputting. Yeah, or like either message or cheat, let's say. A message, weak cheat, strong cheat, one of three things. Yeah. So
your definition of capital A is not capital A to mean strong cheat and little A to mean.
Yeah, that's correct.
But ultimately it's 2+1 weak cheats is small. Small omega is like omega I party saying I have said.
I'm not yet reasoning about what happens after these certificates have been collected, if that's your question. So for now, I'm just defining what the ith party's output is. So it could be that in a higher level protocol, if you collect more than a certain number of things.
Deformation is defined with respect to the higher level. The deformation, right? Or is it like an individual party could get a little omega, but you would say that's okay because you thought this was is it like
yes, that's true. That's a valid output. So that's a relaxation, right? In the sense that everybody else could get the output, but I could get just little omega. So that within the scope of this functionality. Yeah. Yes. So if P0 is honest, then no little omega could be computed against it. So I mean, if the dealer is honest, then it can't be framed. So if I received a little omega that implicates someone, then that person has to be corrupt. I mean, assuming synchrony, whatever, but yeah.
Protocol that we have in the previous slide. This is for like round one, round two. So this is the entire protocol.
Yeah. This is just for the broadcast.
Round one is okay. This is just like the echo, the code was in the thing, but you would also send a message saying I didn't get it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that thing of like I didn't get anything will be the basis for this like weak cheat, basically. Right. So that's why this is defamation free. And then in case the dealer is corrupt, I'll first argue that we achieve consistency, which is that walking through the different cases. Let's say the corrupt dealer sends conflicting messages to some pair of honest parties. That's definitely going to yield a capital omega certificate. Let's say that, and that's done. If the dealer then withholds its message from all honest parties, then that's going to yield a certificate of non-responsiveness. So that's taken care of. So given that we're not in either of these two cases, it must be that any message that's sent to the send to any honest party must be consistent with all other messages sent to all other honest parties. So every honest party will receive either a consistent message or a certificate, which is what we wanted. Right. So one way of thinking about it is that the moment the dealer sends some message to some honest party, that fixes the output. So any subsequent messages that the dealer sends have to be consistent with that first committed message.
So it's like in the protocol, where do you produce an output if you have received? So you receive one admin the big thing, and you got a bunch of other people, but not everyone saying the account you got at least +1.
No, I don't need to wait for T+1.
Just presence.
Yeah, as long as I'm not able to produce either of these two certificates, I mean, it's like a couple of minutes of thinking about it, but if I'm not in either of these two cases, then I have some message with me. Yeah. Yeah. And then I just output that. And the analysis is that it's safe to output that because if I haven't been able to produce any cheats, that means that no other honest party will have a different message. The other honest parties might have cheats, but we might have seen cheats, but right. So that's why it's safe to output whatever message you have. And yeah, so we achieve defamation freeness and we achieve consistency, which is what we wanted from our broadcast primitive.
Also output a message even if you didn't get nothing in the first round and you produce
Yeah.
the ball, but others sending the message, you know.
Yeah, that's an example of I know the dealer is cheating, but I can't prove it because yeah, because the dealer didn't send me the thing, but like I also don't have enough information to implicate the dealer. Right. So yeah, just a couple of notes on this primitive. Just because I have like if I'm a third party coming to this system and somebody shows me a signed message, that doesn't mean that everybody else has the same signed message. In the sense that if the dealer is corrupt and the person I'm talking to is corrupt, then they could just pretend that you know that some different message was agreed upon. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that this doesn't establish consensus. Just because somebody gives me a signed message doesn't mean that consensus is achieved on that message. Yeah, so this becomes important in composition basically. But yeah, just a caveat. Yeah, and about the note on synchrony, right? So all of this analysis falls apart if the network is asynchronous. And this is kind of inherent because in the asynchronous setting, there's really no distinction between an honest party who's cut off versus a dishonest party versus a corrupt party that's being silent on purpose. But it is still important to say what happens when the network goes bad. And yeah, it could be that honest parties are certified non-responsive. And in case, I mean, there are protocols where you might decide that once a party has been identified as corrupt, we can just reveal their inputs or something like that, right? There are protocols that follow the structure. And yeah, what we say is that it's probably in the real world, it's a bad idea to take those kinds of drastic steps based on just non-responsiveness, which is why you might want to distinguish between a party that's proven to be non-responsive versus one that's proven to deviate from the protocol. Right, so that's the mechanism guaranteed, and informally, here's our theorem, which is, I mean, we use this mechanism to construct full-blown MPC with identifiable abort, right? So this is the theorem, which is a lot of text. So instead, I visualize it. So let's say we have some protocol that's by BC that realizes some ideal functionality, right? And in particular, the ideal functionality guarantees that if one of the parties that's invoking this functionality is corrupt, then everybody else is going to identify this person and be in agreement about it. And the protocol that realizes this functionality has a bunch of broadcasts that it may do. So this is the input to my compiler. And like I said, I don't want to rely on broadcasts. So what I do is I define this compiler, which replaces each invocation of broadcast with our new BCIA primitive, right? This new thing that I just defined. And we know that under the hood, this BCIA thing is only going to take 2 point-to-point rounds. So for every round that was in the original broadcast protocol, we now have 1 round of BCIA. We actually have one extra thing for some small technical reason. But yeah, so if we had R rounds originally of broadcast, which it's unclear how to instantiate, etc. etc. Now we have 2R rounds that work in the 2R plus 1 rounds that work in the point-to-point. And point-to-point channels are very easy to instantiate. You just send messages into them. And of course, the distinction is also in what guarantee we're able to provide at the ideal functionality level. Whereas previously, we were assured that all honest parties are going to be in agreement about who the cheater is. Now it could be that one honest party identified a cheat, the other one actually got the output. But the one who identified the cheat now has a proof to go with it that can convince any external third party. Yeah, so that's our compiler.
One more round of normal broadcast and get the original guarantee.
Yeah, so that's actually what the extra round is. But the problem is, oh, sorry, yes, you're right, yeah. So if we had one regular broadcast round, we could use that to like achieve consensus on the person who caused the cheat and so on. Because in the original thing, let's say, so if
Any honest party was supposed to broadcast.
yeah, exactly. So yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's so if you had one broadcast round, you could get back the original, you could recover the original thing.
So it sounds like a cleaner way to state your result in comparison to the previous, right?
Or you
With
remove
the same functionality.
Hmm.
Just that, instead of using so many broadcasts, you can just use one.
let me make sure that I'm not, I mean, that wasn't what we were targeting. So I need to think about it to make sure that there's no subtlety that I'm missing, because there are all sorts of permutations of what could go wrong. Intuitively, I think we even have a line in the paper that remarks something like this, but to make it a formal claim, I would want to think about it a bit more. But intuitively, that should be true. I mean, there are these papers that study broadcast complexity and that say that you need at least 2 broadcasts and so on.
They're not asynchronous.
No, even in the synchronous model, but I think maybe their intention is a bit different in that, like,
It's 2 round, the whole protocol is 2 rounds, and you need to use broadcasts.
right, that
Here
way.
you're adding around.
Exactly, yeah. I'm thinking, right, because they count even point-to-point rounds as like a round, right? So maybe like the fact that you replace this broadcast with 2 point-to-point rounds means that it doesn't apply, it doesn't fit into the original model that people are considering. Yeah. I should check with Divya again. So, right, I mean, now that we have a compiler, that's all great. I'm all about instantiating everything end to end. So now what protocol do we plug into this compiler, right? So Identifiable Abort, like I mentioned earlier, is studied as something of a compromise when guaranteed output is not possible. So people have focused on that exact niche of when is guaranteed output not possible, but Identifiable Abort possible, which is the dishonest majority setting, right? Because you need an honest majority in most cases for guaranteed output. So most of the work, actually all of the work that I can think of in the recent past that has, including mine, that is studied Identifiable Abort is focused on the dishonest majority setting. But remember, we showed that in our, in the scenario that we care about, this honest majority is inherent because you can't even realize broadcast, like the, message transmission without an honest majority. So now what do we plug in over here, right? And this is, I would say that this is an open problem in the sense that this needs some work. It's understudied in the D less than n by 2 setting. So we start small. We start with a threshold ECDSA protocol, right? Like we fix one particular application for which we design such an honest majority protocol. I don't think I have the time to get into the details about this, but intuitively it's based on a 3 broadcast round protocol from a previous work of mine with some pretty light zero knowledge proofs. But just to say a little bit about why it's interesting. So the context is that of threshold signing. As a quick reminder, that is, let's say our friend Bob over here, who has a bunch of Bitcoin, has secured his Bitcoin by storing a signing key on his laptop. Like every time he wants to spend this currency, he signs some transaction. So stealing this key is equivalent to stealing all of Bob's money. And it becomes pretty important to make sure that this key is safe. So what Bob could do instead of storing it in one place is secret share it and store different secret shares on some network of servers, going back to the slide that I started out with of what MPC looks like. And every time Bob wants to sign a message, he authenticates himself to these servers. These servers run some sort of protocol, and then they return his signature. And this distributes the risk of compromise, and that an attacker now has to compromise multiple servers in order to be able to steal Bob's key. So that's the setting. And what scheme do we actually think about to target with this kind of distribution? ECDSA is a pretty common one. It was standardized a while ago, and it's, I would say, the canonical elliptic curve based signing scheme that's deployed on the internet today. The structure is something like this, assuming some familiarity with groups and so forth. The algorithm starts by sampling some one-time nonce, that's k, and then performing an exponentiation or an elliptic curve notation of multiplication, actually. And then there's the, let's say, the signature itself, which is some combination of the signing key, that's sk, and the one-time nonce, that's k. You can ignore this Rx value, it's this ugly thing that's public, so we don't really care about it so much. So yeah, this is where the difficulty lies, the computing this signing equation, basically. In particular, there's some multiplication of secret values. Like this is where you have to think about doing non-trivial things with MPC. And also this k value, which is actually secret, is in the denominator. So you have to do this modular inversion. It's all fine. I mean, without getting into the details, this is roughly got two components. One is a coin tossing, which is this kind of committing and releasing to sample this thing. And then a couple of secure multiplications, which we have a somewhat custom protocol for. Basically, if you're able to do verifiable secret sharing, you can then prove in zero knowledge that you executed this verifiable secret sharing correctly. The NISICs that correspond to this protocol are basically, you could think of as like standard Schnorr-like NISICs in the like elliptic curve setting. Somewhat standard Schnorr-like NISICs. These relationships are not too complicated. So you can prove this using NISICs. And then finally, there's one broadcast round just to reconstruct the signature. And it's super high level. I'm happy to answer questions later about this if there's interest. This ends up being or inducing a protocol that takes 3 broadcast rounds, which ends up becoming 6 point-to-point rounds through our compiler. And yeah, and because this is still a relatively understudied area, there's no standardized way to compare efficiency. And in practice, what we would do or what we plan to do is to run a security of the bot protocol by default, which is much more efficient. And then in case that protocol sees too many aborts, we then fall back to the Identifiable Abort version. So what I think is the right thing to talk about, or like the right efficiency metric for Identifiable Abort, is to talk about worst case efficiency. Because people usually split into optimistic and worst case, but if you're observing aborts, then really it's the worst case that matters. And we implemented this protocol, benchmarked it. It takes about half a second on standard hardware to run our scheme from end to end with, I think, 10 corruption threshold of 10, like overall 21 signing parties. And relative to the dishonest majority setting, interestingly, it's actually slower than some dishonest majority protocols, particularly those that use OT, for reasons that are maybe too much to go into right now, but it's an order of magnitude faster than other dishonest majority protocols that use homomorphic encryption. But it's, again, really tricky to talk about efficiency because I think it's the worst case performance that's important, and that's going to depend on things you can't capture on paper, like network conditions, right? So depending on if I'm an adversary who wants to slow down the protocol, I'm going to take the maximum possible time to send all of my messages, for example. So 6 rounds, multiply that by the timeout that would be there, the worst case, and so on. Right. So overall, Identifiable Abort can be a meaningful way to achieve denial of service resistance. And I argue sometimes more desirable than what guaranteed output provides. And this does require some form of broadcast. And in fact, all known protocols use broadcast as a tool. And this can be quite tricky to instantiate, which is why we formalize this notion as necessary for Identifiable Abort. In particular, we show that it's sufficient, or rather it's useful enough if you're able to certify when people are honest or deviate from the protocol. And we show that it's impossible with the dishonest majority. And in the honest majority setting with the PKI, there's a simple construction. And we use this to construct a compiler generically and also show a specific instantiation that's of real world interest. And yeah, this does end up being more efficient than the guaranteed outputs of ECDSA protocols, the guaranteed output versions of ECDSA protocols. And what we're looking to extend is these ideas to more general purpose secure function evaluation. Like I said, there's a gap in the honest majority Identifiable Abort setting. And there's, given the sheer number of problems in just the honest majority security of the bot version, right? With Boolean MPC, arithmetic MPC conversions, and all garbage circuits, all of these things. Like this is like a whole universe of things that could be interesting to study. And also, I'm curious if maybe you could relax broadcast in a way that's enough for guaranteed output delivery, but maybe it doesn't use consensus in some way. I don't know. Could be something to think about. Since I started giving this talk earlier this year, I've been promising an ePrint version, but there's now sort of a preprint on my website, and I'm happy to share it just for like silly logistical reasons. It's not on ePrint yet, but yeah, happy to take questions.